You can now support Ghost Maps on Patreon. Simply look for We Are HANTU or click the link in the description. Inspired by an account from Elwin. Ghost Maps, entry 128, Seletar, Singapore. Out of all the accounts I've heard over the years, the most common variety has been the National Service horror story. You might not be able to tell though, if you look back on the past 127 entries. I don't think they make up even a quarter of the stories I've collected. But that's because it seems like every national serviceman has at least one. Many of these aren't their own experiences. Something that happened to a friend of a friend from a camp that's no longer active, that sort of thing. Finding an original account though, one that isn't a variation of something I've heard before, that's a real treat. Brian has 3 for me. I guess I'm just sway, he says, then smiles and shrugs as we take a seat at this coffee shop in Bedok. I found it hard to believe at first, but we spoke on the phone a couple of days ago. He shared a little bit about what happened to him and I was convinced. He told me that all his stories happened in the same place. So, instead of breaking our interview into multiple sessions, he'll share all his accounts tonight. After which, I'll get the other side of these stories from the entities that reside in this camp. For now though, Brian and I order our drinks, a taping for him, a yin-yang for myself. There's nothing out of the ordinary about Brian. He's a 48-year-old family man. 1 very darling wife and 2 very handsome sons, he says, with a smile. He works in customer service for one of Singapore's telcos. I ask him if he's experienced anything outside of the camp where all his stories take place. Nothing, bro, he says. I even tried to find out if I have the third eye, but I'm not so, lucky. He makes air quotes with that last word. It's like I said earlier, he says. I really am just sway lah. Or is that chem that's them sway? Our drinks arrive. I tell him that maybe I can shed some light on that. But as I switch my recorder on, I tell him that first, I'd like him to start from the beginning. The beginning, like almost all Singaporean national servicemen, is BMT, basic military training. Brian, however, wasn't stationed at Pulau Tekong, where many NS men serve out their BMT. I was part of a mono intake back in 1995, he says. That means my entire NS life was in one camp, in Seletar. NS tends to be a strange time for young men. They're thrust into a new environment with a group of other young men in a situation unlike anything they've ever faced. Any friend is a port in the storm. For Brian, this came in the form of James. Small world, man, he says. The second lieutenant of my platoon, he was my classmate from secondary school, James. Brian explains that because of their different tertiary paths, after secondary school, James had enlisted earlier. It certainly helped that James had always been the quiet type. He was a prefect, so I guess becoming a second lieutenant suited him, Brian says. Plus, he was the only prefect that the Abings in our level actually liked. James recognized Brian immediately. He greeted Brian warmly, during his intake and promised to keep the platoon sergeants in line. "We won't tekan you, Recruit Brian," he said, then added with a wry smile. "Well, not too much lah." He kept his promise though. The first week went off without a hitch. While his sergeants were strict, they never went overboard. Brian didn't want to stand out, so he didn't make it obvious that he was old friends with James. But if any of his platoon mates spoke ill of their second lieutenant, he made sure to give them a piece of his mind. That second week, though, there was an ominous mood among the recruits and the sergeants. They couldn't put their fingers on why. The weather wasn't too warm, so exercises were never overwhelming. No one had messed anything up, so the sergeants didn't dole out any extra punishment. But everyone was on edge. Even James. Especially James. "I never see him so nervous," Brian said. He kept looking around as if someone was following him. By Thursday, it wasn't so much that the tension had died down, but that the excitement for the weekend had exceeded it. Weekends are precious in NS, after all. Doubly so that first weekend out during BMT. By that evening, exhausted from a day's worth of exercises and drills, Brian knocked out immediately after his evening shower. He thought he would sleep all the way through the night. At around 3 a.m. though, he, along with the rest of the platoon, were awoken by 2 loud crashes, followed by the screech of a woman. The noises were coming from the platoon commander's and specialist's bunk. Brian and a few of his fellow recruits decided to investigate. As they neared their superior's bunk, Brian realized that the woman's scream was mixed with the shouts of a man. The man's voice sounded familiar though. As they peered into the superior's bunk, he learned why. One of the cupboards had been pushed onto its side. The table in the center of the bunk had been flipped over, strewing snacks and army gear all over the floor. And James was pinned down on the ground by 5 of his sergeants. The screeches were both coming from him. His eyes had rolled almost to the back of his head, and he wore a grin that Brian can only describe as pure evil. Suddenly, almost effortlessly, James threw 4 of the sergeants off of him. One of them still held onto his arm, but James lifted him off the ground and shook him off like the sergeant was a child. And that's when Brian noticed that one of the other officers was loudly reciting prayers. James's expression went from an evil grin to a scowl. He turned towards the other officer, but didn't attack. Almost as if there was some kind of invisible wall between them. As the other officer continued praying, James grew more violent. He pushed over another cupboard and even overturned a bed. And seemingly exhausted from the effort, he dropped to his knees. Brian heard him mumbling something, but couldn't make out what it was at first. He took a few cautious steps towards James, both out of curiosity and out of concern for his friend. That's when he heard James chanting in a language he didn't recognize. Chanting in multiple voices, all of which weren't his. He sounded like he was drowning, Brian says. It was at this point when one of the sergeants noticed the recruits gathered at the door. He ordered them to head back to their bunks. The recruits were too confused and frightened at first, but the sergeant barked his orders again. I didn't want to go, but what to do? Brian says. I keep telling myself he was in good hands, that other officer would take care of him. He looks off into the distance for a moment, then says, I still don't know if I did the right thing. The next day, one of the officers told Brian's platoon that James had what he called a nervous hysteria episode. They said it was from stress, and he had been sent to the medical center for treatment, Brian says. Some of the recruits said it looked like he was possessed. The officer vehemently denied this, though, and even threatened to punish anyone who spread nonsense rumors. Still, the platoon sergeant ordered his recruits to stay in their bunks at night and not to go anywhere alone after dark. Quietly, he added that they could bring religious items to camp if they wanted to. Brian didn't see James for the rest of his time in BMT until 2 weeks before it was scheduled to end. It was James's last 2 weeks before his own national service was done. While he was still friendly to Brian, Brian says that James never smiled again. He says that his eyes looked like they were devoid of life, like the James he knew was gone. I asked Brian if he ever saw James after that. No, he says. I lost contact with him after that. I hope he's okay though. He finishes his taping and doesn't say anything for a while. Eventually though, he gives me a weak smile and says, okay, you want to hear the next story? I nod and tell him that we should get more drinks first. If you want to discover more of Southeast Asia's other side, subscribe now and follow us on social media. You can also be one of our supporters on Patreon. Look for We Are HANTU or click the links in the description. Ghost Maps is a HANTU production created by Kyle Ong and Wayne Ray, with art direction by Jolene Lim, and recorded on Audio Technica mics.